Chinese party state is aggressively pursuing the goal to create a modern socialist state built on single Chinese national identity. Chinese Communist Party's forced cultural assimilation in Tibet is systematically undermining and marginalizing Tibetan language and culture. Today, our conversation is on the devastating consequences of Xi Jinping's forced cultural assimilation policy on education and language rights in Tibet, based on the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy's thematic report 2022. I'm glad to introduce our today's guest, Ngawang Lungtok, a researcher from Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy. Welcome to Tibettv studio.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Ngawang, the report mentions Chinese Communist Party's quest for pursuit of this Zhonghua Minzu, the Chinese concept of Chinese national, through the so-called second-generation ethnic policy. In what ways do you think these policies, China's law and policy on education and language in Tibet, over the years have impacted Tibetans in Tibet?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Although China has always had a repressive and authoritarian policy regarding education and language inside Tibet, in order to better understand the second-generation ethnic policy, we have to first understand the bilingual education policy. As far as bilingual education policy is concerned, the bilingual education policy, in theory, grants one to speak and study both the languages, one's native as well as the Chinese. But in practice, working languages in schools as well as at the lowest level, rural level offices is in Chinese, hence carrying out a cultural assimilation which is constantly having devastating impact on Tibetan education and language inside Tibet. And regarding the second-generation ethnic policy, unlike its predecessor, which was derived from the USSR's cultural autonomy policy, which is also, according to many scholars, the cultural autonomy policy implemented by USSR is responsible for its own demise. Hence, many believe that Xi implemented the second-generation ethnic policy, prioritizing national identity over ethnic identity, national language over national language, in this case, Putonghua language, Beijing-based dialect. Yes,
the popular, commonly used.
Yes, over the ethnic languages. So yeah, these are all attempt to either directly or indirectly incorporate or assimilate Tibetan identity into the Han Chinese. Impacts are quite evident. A lot of schools have closed. If you look at some of the schools here, Tago Monastic School, as well as the Sengdu Taoze School. Tago Monastic School was closed in November 2021, if I'm not wrong, and its treasurer as well as its abbot were arbitrarily detained 2 weeks prior to its demolition, and the Chinese also forcefully made local Tibetans participate in the demolition, despite the locals' firm belief that it was against or it was an attack on Tibetan education, language, and consequently Tibetan culture and religion. And as far as Sengdu Taoze School is concerned, Sengdu Taoze School was established under the vision of Khenpo Jigme Pinzo, the well-known Tibetan Buddhist master in the early 80s to late 90s. Yes, the one who established Larungar. And alongside him, Thubten Nubu Rinpoche is also responsible for building Sengdu Taoze Monastic School. Sengdu Taoze Monastic School served as an important institution for education, especially for children of nomads. So obviously, it's the state-run schools have a negative impact on Tibetan children. If you look at the system that's being implemented in Tibet today, children between the age of 6 and 16 are being forced to send to these colonial boarding schools and receive these patriotic education forcefully without the consent of the parents or the children. You can compare it to the de-radicalization camp that's being held inside Hong Kong nowadays. Like Hong Kongers are forcefully put inside these de-radicalization camps, as they call it, in order to generate a sense of fake patriotism towards China. So the same thing is happening inside Tibet. And unlike back in the days when China would blatantly suppress riot, dissent, today China has learned to covertly, via malicious strategies and tactics, to suppress dissent, to suppress Tibetans' innermost desire to of course, study Tibetan language, practice Tibetan religion, and consequently Tibetan cultural heritage. Yes.
The report mentions People's Republic of China's so-called education law that was passed in 1995 that instructed schools, the state-run schools nationwide, to implement Putonghua as the basic language of or medium of instruction. And in recent years, Putonghua is promoted vigorously in Tibet, right? So the so-called education law further instructed schools to cut ties with anything that has to do with religion.
Yes.
So another reason to justify its attacks on schools and classes that are run or established by Tibetan Buddhist practitioners or institutions, right?
Yes.
So what are implications on Tibetan cultural identity of such attacks that are being directed towards anything that is symbolic to religion?
Well, these are all an attempt to synthesize Tibetan identity into the Han Chinese majority. And of course, as we all know, Tibetan Buddhist institutions and monasteries have, since time immemorial, served Tibetan language, promoted Tibetan culture, and of course has been a bastion of Tibetan education inside Tibet. So attacking such institutions are an automatic response of an authoritarian regime in order to achieve their malicious policies that are being implemented inside Tibet.
Let's talk about how the situation gets worse when the Chinese government not only fails to protect the rights of the Tibetans, but also, they criminalize the peaceful dissent.
Of course, as we all know, a right to expression and free speech is among the most important and the most basic rights of all human beings. And of course, suppressing that would have a devastating, harmful impact towards the state. And repression, or as you put it, criminalization of dissent, is a typical response of an authoritarian regime when it faces political challenges. And the same is happening inside Tibet. There's this forced cultural assimilation in order to synthesize Tibetans into the Han Chinese majority. And to give one example, a provision added to the Chinese criminal law in 2015 amendment doesn't really clarify what constitutes a rumor. And this is done purposely in order to curtail freedom of speech, especially with the advent of internet and social media sites on the internet, on social media sites, also with increased censorship and surveillance.
Due to the strict control over information flow inside and outside Tibet by China, receiving and verifying reports from Tibet has become, increasingly challenging. And Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy conducts a regular and systematic investigation of human rights abuses in Tibet and publishes newsletters, thematic reports, annual reports. I was wondering how the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy overcome these challenges or manage to do research even with these kind of restriction and suppression inside Tibet.
Well, thank you for the question. Of course, the challenge is very high, considering 24-hour surveillance and censorship by the Chinese on the internet, and as well as on the people, obviously. But that said, what the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy first gets in touch with our sources inside Tibet, and then once we get information from our source, we make sure to verify this information via numerous verification processes. And once the information is verified, then only we publish. And alongside, we also make sure that our informant is safe and sound, and whatever our publication publishes doesn't harm the well-being of either the informant or his family or close ones. So that is one very important aspect of our research.
Yeah, the center has a do not harm policy.
Yes, obviously. We also stay updated. We think it's very important to update ourselves with Chinese social media sites, especially those run by the state media of China. And then we also, we regularly research and study academic reports on human rights violations inside Tibet, published by major human rights organizations such as the United Nations and Human Rights Watch. And then we also read and research on academic papers published by prominent China watchers, especially those China watchers whose views are unbiased and whose publications are not agenda-based. Yes.
So we were talking about how China is, obliged to follow these international conventions. As a state party to many of the conventions, including International Covenant on Economic, Social and Religious Rights, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. So could you briefly touch upon the recommendations the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy in its thematic report 2022 put forward to the Chinese government and the international community?
Yeah, we have like two recommendations, one towards China and one towards the international community. So the first recommendation and the most obvious recommendation towards China is to stop forced assimilation inside Tibet, especially and also respect Tibetans' fundamental right to freedom and religion, language, education, etc. And the second recommendation to China is to host UN or other independent agencies to come inside Tibet and assess human rights situation inside Tibet, especially the situation of language-based education inside Tibet. And the last one is like very similar to the first one, but the last one, last recommendation to China would be, and it's also very important, would be to respect international human rights treaty and respect and protect fundamental human rights of Tibetan people, because Tibetan people are also human beings, and there needs to be some space, there needs to be some respect, right? Yeah, so those are the three main important recommendations towards China. And as far as recommendations towards international community is concerned, whilst we urge China to host UN or other independent agencies to come inside Tibet and assess human rights situation, we urge international community to send UN human rights experts or special rapporteurs on cultural rights, minority, education, language inside Tibet and assess human rights situation inside Tibet and the urgent situation of education policy inside Tibet. And then we also urge international community to pressure China to submit its state party report on torture, which China still hasn't, and it's been 20 years, and China is known for not submitting its state party report. So we urge international community to pressure them. And the last recommendation would be, since China has signed and ratified Convention on Rights of Child, it should be accountable for its own violations, especially in regards to education policy inside Tibet, and forcing kids from age 6 to 16 to forcefully go into these colonial boarding schools is against the convention's policies and amendments. So we urge international community to pressure China in that regard.
Thank you, Ngawang. Thank you for being with us, and congratulations to the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy for this commendable and informative thematic report.
Thank you.
The Chinese government, as a state party to many of these conventions, has full obligation to protect and implement the provisions of the treaties, and also has an obligation to ensure Chinese constitutional guarantees for the principle of equality and non-discrimination. Unfortunately, the party state continues to violate Tibetans' right to education and language for decades, posing an increasing challenge for the Tibetans in Tibet to maintain and preserve their distinct communities and cultural identities. Thank you for watching this episode of In Conversation with Tibettv.